At this juncture, I want to invite Charles Drago to come forward, and Deborah Conway subsequently, to address issues about what can be done with regard to promoting understanding of what we know about the death of JFK. Charles.
What I'm going to talk to you about this afternoon, I hope, will make you first angry and then hopeful. About a month and a half ago or so, and I'm going to use this as an illustration, I had the dubious distinction of co-hosting a conference, a JFK conference in Providence, Rhode Island. The co-host is a professor of atmospheric chemistry at the University of Rhode Island, which I'll refer to as URI, and a champion of the lone nut belief system. The conference is important for two reasons. It focuses our attention on a question: how, in 36 years after the event, can we still be engaged in the conspiracy, no conspiracy debate? And it also illustrates how we are engaged with an active and sinister enemy whose intention is not only to continue the cover-up, but to perpetuate those systems which took John Kennedy's life. It reveals the latest strategies in their war against the truth and against this country, and I'll illustrate specifically how that happens. I want to give you a brief but distressing view of the quality of the thought, the arrogance, the sheer power of these people, by giving you an idea of some of the ideas that were presented at this so-called conference. Because unless you've spoken to some of these people, you won't get any real feeling of just how distanced from reality, just how absurd and how dangerous their positions are. I'm reading from an abstract from a faculty member, a tenured faculty member of the psychology department of Hobart and William Smith Colleges, who presented a paper at this so-called conference. His arrogance is reflected in its title. He titled his paper, "To Bury JFK." Now, as I read this paragraph from his abstract, I want you to keep in mind the individuals who presented to you Friday and yesterday and today. Keep in mind the distinguished nature of their accomplishments. Keep in mind their motivations. Keep in mind the quality of their presentations. Here's what this professor of psychology would have us believe of them and us all. Part of his psychological analysis, and I'm quoting, will be the claim that the conspiracy community, for reasons derived from the conspiracy voice, is psychologically and cognitively impaired. And more importantly, that impairment is typical for the epistemology of popular culture in America. Other revisionist history conspiracies, like the recovery from repressed memory and the alien abduction movements, will be analyzed and offered as kindred exemplars of the same type of impairment. End quote. So I would like to urge all of us here to contact our nearest clinics and to seek help now before it's too late. It would be funny, but this character presents it honestly, openly, directly, boldly. He reveals that the targets of this operation are academics and students, and ultimately history. Academics are being targeted so as to give those who would otherwise be ignorant of this event a foundation to defend the lone gunman theory, a foundation based in pseudoscience. It is clear. I watched the chairman of the political science department at the University of Rhode Island, in whose department this course is being taught by a professor of atmospheric chemistry, simply be enthralled by the nonsense, to accept it, to see it as being supported by unassailable scientific proof. It was startling, it was terrifying, and it's going to be happening more and more. I want to talk about the students who are targets, not just at this university. The students who are truly the victims of an intellectual molestation. Students who, in the defense of their professor when he was hoisted on his own petard any number of times, whose defense of this guy is most closely akin to some sort of Helsinki syndrome. They are intellectual and emotional hostages of this authority figure, and yet they're the first to defend him, and yet something within them is reacting against what he's telling them. Time after time they would say, well, I believe in conspiracy, but I've never seen any proof for it. I've never seen any proof for it. What does this tell us about the even-handedness of the course? One of the fallback positions of this professor is that, well, regardless of how my students come down on the conspiracy, no conspiracy question, at least I will have instilled in them cognitive thinking, critical thinking skills, which will serve them well through the remainder of their academic and professional careers. Well, the lie was put to that by the students themselves when they delivered their papers. I'll give you two quick examples. One of the students got up to defend the single bullet theory. And he made the following statement. I paraphrase. He said, studies have been done to show that emergency room physicians are incorrect in their initial diagnoses 70% of the time. So we can dismiss the observations of the emergency room technicians at Parkland. Well, if this young man was truly applying critical thinking skills, he would have understood, he would have at least taken into account the fact that Parkland Hospital is one of the premier emergency medical centers in the world, that it is constantly being inundated with gunshot wound victims, and that the only measure of the accuracy of emergency room physicians' ability to diagnose wounds would be an analysis of those physicians' track records who attended John Kennedy that day. There were other examples. A young woman who was a psychology major presented a rehash of Renatus Hartog's evaluation of Lee Oswald. Essentially, he was predisposed to violence and perfectly capable of killing the president. Her critical thinking skills were not sufficiently developed so as to have her investigate the manner in which Hartog's testimony to the Warren Commission is shown to have been close to, if not over the line of perjury. She didn't think to look at that, didn't mention it, didn't know anything about it. Still on? Yeah. Point is, if the object of the class was to instill critical thinking skills, these papers get Fs. If the object of the class is to recruit young lone nut soldiers, then the papers get an A. 7 minutes. Okay. When I began dealing with this fellow in this conference, I called him, and his ilk, flat earthers. Members of the Institute for Creative Anachronism, people who were making an outrageous claim. But I came to realize that that was too benign, too cute a description. What we have going on out there is the equivalent of Holocaust denial. And what we have in this pseudoscience that they're bringing to the table is the equivalent of the old Institute for Historical Research, where they had people going into crematoria and the camps and chipping away at the mortar and saying, well, we've run tests and we've discovered no traces of cyanide gas in the mortar, therefore the Holocaust didn't happen. These simple-minded, designed with intellectual dishonesty approaches to the study of this case are going to become more and more prevalent, I submit to you. And so our responsibility to get out there and use what we know is heightened. Because the war is ongoing, the enemy is there. I want to make it quick. Okay. We have to ask ourselves a question. I've asked it in Dallas and to other groups, and I've yet to hear an answer. And I don't expect to get one today, but it's the ultimate question we have to ask ourselves. What do we want? What should all of this result in that would make us happy, and if not go home, then at least stand down into a vigilant or a guard mode? Everyone here has to think about that question and come up with an answer. And we have to come to some consensus on it because we cannot plan a route unless we have a destination in mind. And I have yet to hear from in any meaningful way, representative of the majority of our viewpoints, where we want to go? We have to answer that question. We have to answer the question, what are we prepared to do? Yesterday I used the term war often. I used the term propaganda often, and a few people have said that they were uncomfortable with those terms. Well, I'm reminded of Gandhi's dilemma when asked if his nonviolent approach to social change would have worked if instead of having his country occupied by the British, they had been occupied by Hitler and his troops. And Gandhi had no ready answer, although he did seem to imply that his methodology would have been slightly altered. In the past, I've argued for us to assume the methods and tactics and weapons of the enemy in order to effectively combat and win. And yet I'm as troubled by that as anyone here. I don't want to sell my soul to the devil to beat the devil. That trick never works. And yet, as the years go by and the enemy becomes ever more subtle and no less dangerous and no less intent upon winning this war, we have to ask ourselves, who are we? What do we want? And what are we prepared to do to get what we want? In the next year, at the outside, we have to find ways to overcome the personal differences we have with each other, the ideological differences, the serious, honest objections we have to nuances in each other's work, and even more than nuances. We have to find a way to reach consensus to overcome the internecine struggles that have factionalized us, weakened us. And certainly the enemy has had a great deal to do with that. Our communities have been penetrated, have been marginalized, have been demonized. But it does no good to point the finger out there and cry into our beers and say, my God, they're so strong, they're beating us. We must heal ourselves first. Because unless we're prepared to recognize our failures as well as celebrate our successes, we are getting nowhere. I don't know how it's going to happen. I'm not wise. I'm often foolish, but I know that unless we can do it, we fail. So let that be our charge as we leave here today. Not just to continue to preach to the choir, not to be content with the warmth of our reception and the good fellowship that we experience in these conferences. Those of us who wish to rise to positions of leadership, those of us who are committed to this not as a hobby, but as literally to a life and death struggle, had best come together. If our personal viewpoints are not accepted in the consensus or only partially accepted into the consensus, and we can live morally and intellectually with the consensus, then we've got to do everything we can to put our egos aside, salute sharply, and do what has to be done. I'm not wise enough to know the structure of what this will be. I'm not bold enough to even suggest basic ideas. So that is our challenge, and that is our mission. And I'd say in closing that as the next century turns, I don't think this is going to become the Lincoln assassination, but for the wrong reason. It won't become the Lincoln assassination because it won't fade or lose its emotional resonance. It won't become the Lincoln assassination because it's going to happen again. Perhaps not in the form of a presidential assassination, but this system will radically correct itself again when a John F. Kennedy-like threat to it rises. It'll happen in our lifetimes, and we'll make the connection, we'll make the comparison, and it won't go away. What we want to do is make it go away for the right reason, because we will have used our knowledge to change the systems that made this thing happen and to ensure that it won't happen again. I hope and pray that that's what we have the courage and the vision to do. And let me echo everyone else here by saying thank you for having the courage and expending your resources of time and money and emotion to come here. and I hope join together. Thank you.
Our second speaker is Deborah Conway.